Welcome everybody from CAFE, the BU and Harvard Climate and Health Research Coordinating Center. Today's CAFE seminar is part of our State of the Science seminar series, where we invite experts from around the globe to talk about what's known about relationships between climate exposures and health in a particular domain, and to identify remaining research gaps. And so today we're going to be discussing the state of the science on the impacts of environmental change on infectious disease risk. And we're fortunate to have a true expert on this topic here to talk to us about it today, Dr. Rachel Lowe. Dr. Lowe is the Global Health and Resilience Group Leader at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center and a research professor at the Catalan Institute for Research and Advanced Studies. Her research focuses on co-developing policy-relevant methodological solutions to enhance surveillance, preparedness, and response to climate-sensitive disease outbreaks and emergence. And her work has enabled the integration of seasonal climate forecasts into early warning systems for infectious diseases in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe, for joining us today. And I'm going to go ahead and let you take it away. But for the audience, you should see a chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have questions for Dr. Lowe, feel free to post them there. You won't be able to unmute yourself, but you're welcome to ask questions there. And at the end of Dr. Lowe's talk, we will have a moderated Q&A session where we ask some of the questions that have been posted in the chat. So feel free to use that as Dr. Lowe is presenting. And with that, I'm going to let you take it away, Dr. Lowe. Thanks again for joining us. And we can see your slides already. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me here. So I have the pleasure of sharing some of the research we've been doing over the last few years around modeling and understanding the impacts of environmental change on infectious disease risk. So I'm sure many of you now are familiar with this visualization, which is known as the warming stripes. This was developed by Professor Ed Hawkins from the University of Reading and has become an iconic visualization of the challenge we're facing in terms of global warming. We can see here the warming stripes, which are showing us the changes in annual global temperatures from 1850 through to last year, and we can see that we're running out of shades of red to represent how hot it is getting. In 2024, it was the warmest year on record. This also coincided with the worst dengue outbreaks ever recorded in Brazil. And this warming is contributing to negative health outcomes in terms of food insecurity, water shortages, heat-related mortality, and spread and expansion of infectious diseases. The World Health Organization estimates that around half the world are living in areas at risk of mosquito-borne diseases such as dengue and malaria. And this, due to climate change, we're seeing an expansion of the areas in which dengue can be spread. This is an analysis that we conducted a few years ago in Brazil, where we find that dengue outbreaks are spreading further south into Brazil and occurring in the southern region of the country. And since this study was published, more and more outbreaks have been reported in this region. Also, due to increased connectivity with more remote areas, we're seeing outbreaks also spreading into the Amazon rainforest. And projection studies have shown that if we are to continue with business as usual, with warming up to 3.7 degrees C by the end of the century, which is the trajectory at which we're currently following, then we can expect to see an additional 4.7 billion people living in areas at risk of these diseases. Whereas if we could start mobilizing and implementing climate action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we could see this number dramatically reduced, and this would also have huge co-benefits for our health in terms of cleaner air and safer and more livable cities. So we can use climate information to develop indicators to help track and understand changes, for example, in the suitability for the transmission of infectious diseases like malaria and leishmaniasis. These are two examples of indicators that our team produces for the Lancet Countdown collaboration, which is an international collaboration tracking progress on health and climate change. On the left here, we can see areas that became newly suitable in the last 10 years for the transmission of both Plasmodium falciparum and Vivax malaria. And on the right, we can see areas which are becoming newly suitable for the transmission of leishmaniasis. And we're beginning to see diseases that were previously restricted to the tropics and subtropics, either emerging or re-emerging in places like Europe, which is due to a combination of climate change, international travel and trade. And this is posing new threats for public health systems in areas that have no previous experience of dealing with these kind of emergencies and have naive populations, which can lead to potentially explosive outbreaks. We can see here that over the last few decades, we're seeing more and more autochthonous cases in Europe, which are leading to localized outbreaks. We've seen, for example, in the last few years, outbreaks of dengue and West Nile in Italy, in France, and this is leading to a new kind of emergency that we need to have the tools to address. So as well as climate change, which is leading to new areas to become climatically suitable for both vectors and the pathogens they transmit, climate change is also leading to more intense and frequent extreme events, such as tropical cyclones or droughts or floods. And we conducted a scoping review to understand the risk of infectious disease outbreaks in the aftermath of these kind of extreme events and the kind of evidence that exists around those. And so you can find evidence in the literature documenting outbreaks of diarrheal disease and other waterborne diseases following, for example, heavy rainfall, tropical cyclones. There's less evidence around the occurrence of malaria after these extreme events, and emerging evidence around the links between drought and dengue. And that's something I'm going to speak a little bit more about later on in the talk. And as well as climate change, we're seeing issues around environmental degradation, which is leading to a resurgence of malaria in places like Venezuela, where we're seeing large areas of the Amazon rainforest in this region being transformed for illegal gold mining. A few years ago, we published a study analyzing different drivers of this changing malaria risk in the region, and we found an association between both deforestation and mining on the transmission of the different malaria parasites, and that by accounting for mining within our space-time modeling framework, this explained a fair bit of the variation that we were seeing. So at the Global Health Resilience Group, we're working in partnership with different countries across Latin America and the Caribbean, in Africa, in Europe, and in Asia, particularly with ministries of health, environment agencies, and humanitarian centers, to co-create early warning systems and digital public goods that can be incorporated into decision-making processes to help build resilience against these global change factors, which are leading to both the spread of infectious diseases and an increase in the intensity of outbreaks. We have several projects which are funded by the Wellcome Trust, Horizon Europe, and through a series of different contracts. And we're working across spatial domains, time horizons, and disciplines from the local scale all the way up to the global scale, using different downscaling and upscaling techniques to learn across these different scales, and also to track historical changes, to make short-term predictions and to produce scenarios going into the future. We're also developing modeling approaches to incorporate aspects of One Health in terms of monitoring animal, environment, and human health within the IPCC framing of risk when we talk about climate change, so that we can try and account for the overlapping hazards, vulnerabilities, and exposures to these different threats. And we're working with climate data across multiple timescales. We're using reanalysis and ground truth data from weather stations, for example, to understand historical changes, so the observations that have occurred and how they are linked to different health outcomes. And then we're looking to develop decision support tools to address questions which may be in the short term, using weather forecasts, for example, for heat health early warning systems, or looking at climate predictions from sub-seasonal to seasonal to decadal scales, which can help, for example, vector control programs prioritize where they want to implement their interventions or to plan vaccination strategies. And we're also looking at climate change projections to help with longer term planning and implement those into national health adaptation plans, for example. And with these different types of information, we can address different problems in terms of preparedness and response, to guide nature-based solutions, to evaluate interventions, for example, the rollout of a Wolbachia campaign, and also to help countries who want to apply for loss and damage financing. So those countries that have contributed less to the climate change problem but are suffering the worst consequences. So our group has published a range of different modelling studies to integrate information on the impacts of climate extremes and different hydrometeorological indicators. And we've used this kind of information to provide early warnings for diseases like dengue and leptospirosis across Latin America, in Vietnam. And we've been developing this knowledge that we've gained from working with partners in different regions to come up with a framework and different tools to develop these climate-driven early warning systems. We recently published a chapter in this book on planetary health approaches to understand and control vector-borne diseases, to look at considerations around the importance of partnership building and engagement, conducting feasibility studies, the iterative process of developing tools, and the challenges around implementing those kind of solutions. This is an example of an early warning system that we produced with the Ministry of Health back in 2014. This was ahead of the World Cup that took place. And since then, we've been looking to innovate this approach and the way that we can communicate information from probabilistic forecasting models, which are informed using seasonal climate forecasts to produce an ensemble of different possible outcomes of when and where we might see outbreaks. And we've been looking to develop modelling approaches to be able to account for delayed and non-linear impacts of different climate drivers on climate-sensitive infectious diseases, particularly mosquito-borne diseases. We can see here a very nice diagram by Martha Shockett and colleagues that's published in the same book that I shared earlier, which just gives a demonstration of the sort of thermal limits related to vectors and these optimum temperatures, and when it gets too cool or too warm, then we can see the ideal conditions for transmission decrease. And when we're thinking about rainfall, we tend to see an increased risk up to a point, with high rainfall potentially flushing out breeding sites. But when it's very dry, we can also see an increase in water storage, which can lead to additional breeding habitats. So this is a sort of mechanisms we've been trying to incorporate into our modelling frameworks. Here you can see, this is an image of one of the most densely populated favelas in the city of Rio de Janeiro. And you can see lots of blue spots on this image, and they are temporary water storage containers, which are relied upon in times of water shortage to collect water. And this kind of situation, combined with a lack of environmental hygiene and inadequate waste disposal mechanisms, very densely populated area, and more extreme events, this can lead to the perfect storm of explosive dengue outbreaks. We can see here the kind of temporary water reservoir that may be placed. For example, this is a square in a northeastern city of Brazil, and how this can very quickly become sort of a favorable breeding site for the vectors. So this is an example of a study that we conducted in Brazil, following on from some earlier work that we did in partnership with the Ministry of Health and Wellness in Barbados, where we found this interesting link between drought, exceptionally wet conditions, and dengue. So we wanted to test this out in a large geographical domain. So here we can see dengue incidence on the left across the Brazilian states, organized roughly in the geographical shape of the states across Brazil. And on the right, we can see over the same time period, which is from 2000 to 2019, the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which gives us an idea of exceptionally wet conditions in green and exceptionally dry conditions in brown. And you can see that over the last few years, we've seen a real increase in the duration and intensity of the drought events, particularly in the north and northeast of the country. So we applied a modeling technique where we integrated distributed lag nonlinear models within our Bayesian space-time framework, and identified this pattern where around 3 to 5 months after exceptionally dry conditions, we see an increased risk of dengue, but also immediately after exceptionally wet conditions. And we found that this situation was particularly exacerbated in the urban areas, which are the areas that were experiencing water shortages, which led to additional sort of household breeding, household water storage and additional breeding sites. And as expected from sort of lab studies and the literature, we found these sort of typical curves related to temperature, with increased minimum temperatures around 2 to 4 months prior, increasing the risk of dengue. We've also been using different modeling approaches to isolate different kinds of drivers in terms of climate, human mobility, and urban infrastructure. This is some findings from a modeling study that we conducted in Vietnam, understanding these drivers at the district level across Vietnam. And here we're showing that if we look at the changes in dengue risk driven by by temperature alone, we can see a sort of an expansion and a shift in the patterns, with more outbreaks happening between sort of October, November, December, and a shift further north into the higher and cooler areas of the country. And we've also been using these kind of modeling techniques to be able to help understand the effectiveness of interventions. And we've been working with the National Environment Agency in Singapore, where we've developed a model with using both climatic drivers and serotype switch events to be able to generate a counterfactual scenario to compare to the distribution of dengue after the intervention of the Wolbachia campaign there. And this kind of modeling approach has proven to be as effective as a machine learning approach that's been used operationally in Singapore, and has the added value that you can use it more easily to generate different kinds of scenarios. So I'm briefly now going to introduce to you some of the digital tools that we are developing to try and make these kind of studies that I've presented to you more reproducible and more they can be scaled up and applied in different settings by different researchers and practitioners. So we recently published, together with Claudio Cordeso from the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, a review looking at challenges around harmonizing multi-source data for vector-borne disease risk management. And in this paper, we review the different initiatives that exist out there that are bringing together sort of multi-scale data to support vector-borne disease risk management. And we also lay out a data harmonization process from co-defining the question to collecting the data, to agreeing on drafting data sharing agreements, post-processing, documenting and sharing code, testing and evaluating, and continuously disseminating and updating these results. And thanks to the Wellcome Trust, we have a Digital Technology Award where within our consortium called Harmonize, we're developing different toolkits that can be applicable in different kind of different settings. For example, we're developing tools to help deal with harmonizing data to address challenges in cities, in the Amazon rainforest, in the Colombian highlands, in small islands. And through this project, we're integrating satellite imagery with different kinds of gridded climate products together with strategically collected drone images and weather station data that we have installed in places where there's a lack of ground truth data, and developing packages and resources to integrate this with both socioeconomic and demographic indicators and disease surveillance data. This is just an example of one of our drone images from the Peruvian Amazon site in Loreto, where you can understand and pick up details when we see areas that are particularly flooded, or the way that water storage practices may change. And our partners in Peru are developing different AI algorithms to help understand how larger scale satellite imagery can learn from this kind of detailed imagery that we're collecting. These are a few images from a field campaign that we conducted in the Colombian Andes, where we worked together with the community members to survey different areas where we were seeing particularly sort of new and severe outbreaks of dengue. We identified, for example, some illegal fly tipping sites, and we flew some drones and installed a weather station in an ecological reserve. And it was a very rewarding experience to see how the local community were really engaged with these kind of tools and wanted to have access to these kind of resources to make these kind of measurements themselves. This is the toolkit that we are currently developing within the Harmonize project. So we have a series of tools which will allow users to eventually bring all their data to the same space-time resolution. So we have a tool called CLIM for Health that allows one to access, post-process and downscale data to the spatial aggregation required for a health analysis. We also have tools to convert line list data to some kind of policy relevant administrative level to address the kind of questions that we've showed earlier. We're also developing tools to process satellite imagery and drone data, and also to interact with cube technology to be able to deal with these vast amounts of drone imagery. So why do we need these kind of tools? So if we think about the CLIM for Health tool, we're trying to find ways to understand how adequate the gridded climate data sets may be depending on your local setting. So if we think about small islands in the Caribbean, here we can see the ICREA 5 land product. We're looking at precipitation here mapped over a few different islands. So on the left, we can see the Dominican Republic. And given this is a relatively large island, you can actually see some of the local topography, for example, through this image. But when we're working with really small islands, for example, in Barbados or Grenada or St. Lucia, these kind of gridded products cannot really add much information. We really then want to be working with weather station data from the islands to drive these kind of localized models. This is an example of a study that we conducted to understand the sensitivity of the climate inputs within a health impact model. So here we have an example for a climate-driven dengue model and a malaria model in the southern coastal region of Ecuador. And just to give you an example, if we were to look at the model outputs using temperature data from a weather station within the city where the dengue cases were being reported, then for a 1 degree increase in temperature, we would expect a 68% increase in the relative risk of dengue. Whereas if we were to use, for example, the ICREA gridded climate product, we would expect a 40% increase. So we can see some differences there. If we look at the malaria example, Using the weather station data, we found a negative association between precipitation and malaria incidence, whereas several of the products indicated an increase or a positive association. So this study was really to give a word of warning of the dangers of taking these kind of global products off the shelf and applying them to address local issues and questions. And we really need to, where we can, validate using ground truth data. This is just to give you an idea of the kind of spatial scales we're working with in the Colombian Andes. So here in orange, we can see our one of our study sites, Cajamarca, in the state of Tolima. These red symbols here are indicating the existing weather stations in the region. And then we have installed 3 weather stations along an altitudinal gradient. And this will help us understand how well both the reanalysis product, which is represented by this blue grid here, this 9 kilometer square grid, can represent that sort of change in temperature along the altitudinal gradient. And then we're also looking at ways to downscale forecasts from this larger grid. So this is a 100 kilometer square grid to the level of the reanalysis and then down to the level of the stations. So this is kind of a work in progress, and we're also building an R package, the Clim for Health package, to be able to do that. So once we have our harmonized data sets, we can then look to develop different kinds of modeling approaches, bringing in delayed and nonlinear climatic drivers and their compound effects, and different ways that we can try and account for the different drivers of disease risk and build this into some kind of model that can then provide us with forward-looking predictions. And we're building this kind of framework within a project called ID Extremes, where the goal is to predict the probability of infectious disease outbreaks given these compound and cascading extreme events. So to be able to account for a flooding event, which may be preceded by a drought, and what this means for early warnings. And we're working in partnership with existing platforms. For example, we're working with Médecins Sans Frontières in their malaria map project to try and improve how we can issue malaria early warnings in South Sudan. We're working with the Infodengue team in Brazil to try and extend the lead time of the early warnings provided within that program. And we're also working with the Red Cross to develop a malaria early warning and action early action protocol in Colombia. And so this is sort of an outline of the suite of R tools that we're developing in the Global Health Resilience Group. So we've developed an R package to allow one to explore the harmonized data to see if the data can actually lend itself to some kind of space-time analysis. We need to make sure that we have sufficient space-time coverage to be able to conduct these kind of modeling approaches. And then in our GHR model package, this allows you to run different kinds of models using INLA, for example, together with distributed lag nonlinear models or approaches to look at interactions between different drivers. And then in our GHR predict package, this allows the users to use the best selected model to make forward-looking predictions and perform a series of different model evaluation techniques and produce an ensemble of different outcomes. And we've just recently started a new project called Tactic, which is led by Ana Vicedo at the University of Bern, where we're looking to develop different health impact attribution studies using counterfactual climate simulations to really understand the role of anthropogenic climate change in changing disease burden. So we hope that in the next couple of years, we can also develop a user-friendly package to address those kind of questions. So through all this digital technology work, we've had a few spin-off initiatives with our partners across Latin America and the Caribbean. So during the 23 to 24 El Nino event, our partners wanted to deploy the kind of techniques we've been using to try and make some forward-looking predictions of the risk of different outbreaks given the El Nino event, which we know when we see a warming of the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, we can see exceptionally warm and wet conditions along the western coast of South America, or exceptionally dry conditions in the Amazon region, and flooding events in northern Argentina. And we wanted to see how all of this could feed into a platform providing seasonal predictions from 1 to 6 months in advance. And this is an example of the kind of visualizations. We're translating the probabilistic information into these levels of warnings, with the idea is to tailor these kind of alert levels with the kind of actions that should be taken by the local authorities, from routine action, being aware, being prepared, and then taking action with the recommended actions for that particular region. So this is just a look into the platform and what it looked like for Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador back in early 24. Last year, we also took part in a dengue modelling challenge, which was run by the InfoDengue team and the Moss Climate Project, which is a sister project of ID Extremes. And in this challenge, the Brazilian Ministry of Health wanted an outlook of the risk of dengue for 2025, given the unprecedented level of dengue that was experienced first in 23 and then in 24. So we adapted the modelling approaches that we've been developing to understand these delayed and non-linear impacts into a modelling framework. And alongside several different teams, we produced several different sort of validation runs. This is an example of the validation run for the state of Amazonas for 2024. So we can see this black dashed line is showing the observed dengue cases for the 2024 season. The orange line is showing the output from the GHR, the Global Health Resilience Model. So we were quite reassured that the tools we're developing, at least in this instance, could do a relatively good job at capturing the observed patterns. And the team issued a kind of scoring table. This was issued at the time of the Paris Olympics. And you can see that no single model does particularly well in any particular state or time period. But by using this multi-model approach, we can learn from different kinds of approaches and bring together sort of the best of these different modelling approaches. And that's currently been written up in a manuscript, which we hope will be published soon. And just for the last portion of my talk, I just wanted to share with you a little bit around the co-creation experience of developing a dengue early warning system in the Caribbean region. This is often a question we get asked, of sort of practical examples of sort of making sure this kind of work can actually be implemented in practice. And of course, the key ingredient to this kind of work is strong partnerships. And we've been incredibly fortunate since 2017 to have been working in partnership with the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, and the local ministries of health, particularly in Barbados, we can see here. We recently published a publication outlining our experience in terms of the pieces that were needed to bring all this together, from the national level operational services, the regional bodies, the different kind of funders, the interdisciplinary research team. And over the years, we've published, as well as modelling studies, we've been documenting the kind of co-learning that we've been doing together, and the kind of barriers and blocks you face to actually implement this, this sort of work on the ground. And we recently published an implementation framework to lay out the kind of steps that are needed to develop an early warning disease warning system in this kind of setting. So just coming back to the modelling approach and how this started. So we were initially working with the Barbados Ministry of Health and Wellness, who told us that they were starting to see a change in dengue epidemiology, and they thought this might be linked to a new recommendation with the exceptional drought conditions to store water under households, but this was unintentionally leading to these additional breeding sites. So we brought together the dengue instance rates and the drought indicators into these modelling frameworks. And this is where we first sort of documented these delayed and nonlinear associations. And then we evaluated how well these incorporating these delayed and nonlinear effects in our modelling approach could do. And this is a visualization that we produced to show the probability of an outbreak according to the model, indicated by the shading, the level of shading of the colour. And then the cross indicates if an outbreak actually occurred or not. And this kind of work has been incorporated initially in a qualitative way within the Caribbean Health Climatic Bulletin. So, for example, if we are in a drought period, but then we have a forecast for exceptionally wet conditions, then alerts can be issued to the different agencies to make sure that water storage containers are cleaned and well maintained. So we first started thinking about how we could roll this out in an operational service. So we were working together with the Barbados Meteorological Service, who have a suite of different climate services for dust haze and different kinds of climatic hazards. And we made this initial mock-up where we could show the risk level for Barbados and use this kind of impact-based matrix, which was proposed by the World Meteorological Organization, which, depending on the impact of the event and the confidence of the model that the event will happen, you can issue these different kind of alerts. But of course, when you come to implement this, there's always challenges around funding gaps or technical capacity and financial resources. So we've been trying over the years to try and develop training programs and different ways to build like capacity and fill this gap between the health sector and the climate sector to have these kind of interdisciplinary skills. Another challenge we found is that the distributed lag approach is very data intensive and doesn't necessarily align with the operational climate services wherever you're trying to implement this. So, for example, if we wanted to issue a forecast valid for October 3 months in advance, we'd have to stitch together observations with 4 months worth of forecasts and then update that. And that didn't really align with the operational timeframes of the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, who issue drought and heat outlooks on a monthly basis, but with a different framework. So bearing in mind the operational capabilities and trying to simplify this framework, we've now developed a new long-short lag methodology, which helps identify the optimum long lag and short lag driver to be able to capture this relationship between dry conditions followed by wet conditions. And if we look at this kind of scenario here, if we're to observe dry and hot conditions and then we have a forecast for wet conditions, then according to the model framework that we've developed in Barbados, this would indicate a high risk of a dengue outbreak. Whereas if it's dry and cool and then we have a forecast for it to continue to be dry, then that would indicate a low risk of outbreaks. And we've just had this work accepted for publication in Lancet Planetary Health, so I hope to be able to share that with you soon. This is just to give you an idea how we can translate this simplified approach to mimic the kind of findings we were finding from the distributed lag nonlinear model. So if we look at a cool scenario, then whether it's dry or wet, we're generally not going to have a high risk of a dengue outbreak. Whereas if it's we have warm conditions and we have these dry conditions followed several months later by the exceptionally wet conditions, that's where we see this increased risk of dengue. So as well as this kind of these methodological approaches, we've also been thinking about how we can communicate this kind of information to the end users. So as a statistical modeler, we might come up with a kind of this probability density function to look at the proportion of the curve that is exceeds a given threshold. Whereas in collaboration with the Chief Medical Officer in Barbados, they suggested this more sort of visually intuitive visualization, this gauge plot. So we can very quickly see what's the probability of outbreak and which risk category does it correspond to. So this is sort of a work in progress, and we're developing this into a platform that will be hosted at the Caribbean Public Health Agency. And as well as the kind of questions you need to address to develop and identify your best model, we've also been looking at example questions for early warning system implementation the kind of things around what kind of stakeholders will be involved and what capacity, who will be in charge of maintaining or funding this early warning system in the long term, what kind of graphical outputs are needed, and for who. So we've identified that some sort of high-level users may just want like a very quick PDF printout with just a table of the key results, whereas perhaps the entomological teams would like to see the risk combined with some sort of vector mapping. It's also very important to define the monitoring and evaluation plan that's suitable for the particular setting and think about what kind of indicators can be monitored to test the efficacy of the system and to be able to distinguish between successful forecasts compared to false alarms, and what is the return on investment. Finally, we are exploring now the possibility of partnering with the Destination Earth program, which is developing digital twins of the Earth to be able to produce high-resolution simulations. We're particularly working with partners at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center on how we can integrate the climate adaptation digital twin, which produces multi-decadal simulations and also looks at different worlds in terms of historical 2-degree warming world, present conditions, so we can address different kinds of scenarios. And we're thinking about how we can integrate this fine-scale information into different national health adaptation plans. We can see here an example on the top right, the resolution of the sort of standard climate simulation models, and on the bottom left, the resolution for the digital twin. I don't have this image over the Caribbean, but we can pick up, for example, some of the smaller islands in Spain. So this kind of technology and high performance computing may have promise to help us more efficiently implement this kind of work and take it to scale. And finally, one of the most important components of all of this research is capacity strengthening and knowledge exchange between the different actors involved, from the researchers to the medical health officers to the national disease control programs. And so we're also very engaged in developing these kind of tools. And I think I will leave it there and leave time for any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe. That was fantastic. I'm blown away by the the quality and breadth of work that you guys have been doing. Such important contributions to be developing these early warning systems. So I want to first prioritize the questions that have come in the chat, and folks feel free to post more questions in the chat if you think of any. I also have some questions, but I'll prioritize the ones in the chat. So Tovi Lemon, I hope I'm pronouncing that name right, asks, what is the meaning of outbreak probability if it occurs essentially annually? Is it a Boolean outcome or describes the number of cases by severity?
Okay, so when we're talking about outbreak probability, first of all, with the ministries of health, depending on where we're working, we want to understand what are these sort of epidemic thresholds which are used in practice to trigger an alarm. And that's typically the endemic channel. It might be defined as the mean plus 1 or 2 standard deviations. It may be the 75th percentile. So depending, we identify a epidemic threshold, if you like, and then we look at the using outputs from a probabilistic framework. We look at the number of the ensembles, if you like, or samples that exceed this epidemic threshold, and then we use that to calculate probabilities. And then if we want to decide if an alert is triggered or not, we use, for example, ROC analyses to identify the probability trigger threshold. So above which probability would it be meaningful, at least statistically, to trigger an alarm and mobilize resources. So that's what we mean by probability thresholds.
That makes perfect sense. And I assume it's a bit of a tricky trade-off identifying that threshold, because presumably you don't want to ask folks to deploy resources if you're if there's a high chance nothing will happen, or nothing extreme will happen, since a lot of these are low resource settings, and so you might only have a limited number of times that you can deploy resources per season. Um, let's see. Let's do a hot topic question from Quinn Adams. Has your group explored machine learning and AI for predictive modeling? And if so, how have these compared to your in-law DLNM predictions?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, we've been working with the European Space Agency, developing a machine learning approach for Brazil, which has looked very promising. And we recently conducted a formal analysis for Singapore, where we compared a lasso machine learning approach to the INLA approach. And it was very interesting to see how the models were they compared quite well. In some cases, the lasso model better captured one outbreak, whereas the INLA model better captured another outbreak. And what we found is the advantage of the INLA framework, for example, is it's easier to sort of isolate and identify these different drivers. Because once you move to a machine learning approach, then it can become a little bit more difficult to disentangle all the different drivers. But certainly our group is moving in the direction of developing more machine learning and AI approaches, and we're hoping to also integrate this with the digital twin technology as well.
Yeah, interesting to think about how sort of classical statistical uncertainties would also sort of come from these machine learning models. I assume that your all's work is taking into account kind of traditional margins of error from that are sort of calculated from these more traditional statistical models, and sometimes those can be a little bit more tricky to get from AI and machine learning models. So it'd be interesting to think about how you would get those in some cases. Let's see. Another question from the chat. Any efforts to explore effects on animal or plant pests or diseases that are not zoonotic?
Well, we've been within the Lancet Countdown framework, the kinds of vectors and pathogens that we're developing indicators for. We're currently looking at Anopheles stevensii indicator model. We're also been looking at developing, we have a machine learning modeling approach to look at the spread of leishmaniasis. So yeah, we have like a range of different vector and pathogen models. A lot of our work has been focused around dengue and malaria, but we're also exploring some other pathogens as well.
Thanks. Okay, I see one last question in the chat. Folks, feel free to post more questions if you have them. Let's see, this is from Toby Lemon. Again, have you tried to model or explain the extreme dengue epidemics in West Africa in the past 2 seasons? What is your prediction for the future on that?
I haven't personally worked in that region, but I have just joined the advisory board of a project called Arbor Watch, which is led by partners in Kenya, and they're planning to develop a Arbor Watch early warning system for the African region. And I'm hoping that at least some of our tools that we've developed in other regions might be able to help contribute to that effort.
Awesome. Oh, yeah, interesting question. Any related work on tick-borne disease?
Yeah, we did actually just publish a modeling study looking at Lyme disease in Germany, which looks at the sort of interesting interaction between different land use types and the climate drivers, and how this might be related to contact with deer populations. We also have developed a tick indicator, which is of public health relevance for different tick-borne diseases, for the global Lancet countdown, and that should be published in the next report in November.
Very cool. Looking forward to seeing that. Any effort to predict the migratory patterns of these vectors and disease?
We've been looking, for example, at using simulation studies, looking at different socioeconomic and concentration pathways to make sort of predictions given these different scenarios. And we're also starting to look at counterfactuals as well, so we can try and tease apart these different global drivers and see, you know, what might be the different drivers of spread of certain vectors into new regions.
Super important. I think I have a question now. I don't know, this might be a controversial question, but I've been told by some folks who work in epidemiology. I'm not an infectious disease epidemiologist myself at all, but I've been told that sort of as the geographic comfort zone for mosquitoes that spread malaria and dengue shifts northward over the next century or so, north towards more areas where treatment for these diseases tend to be sort of readily available, that overall global deaths from those diseases might actually be expected to decrease. I expect that there's more nuance to the story than I'm doing justice to here, but I was wondering if you agree with that, and if you could comment on any other nuances that I'm missing there.
Well, I guess some studies show that parts of the globe may become too hot for the transmission of certain vector-borne diseases. So you may see like a redistribution, but certainly doesn't mean that those areas new areas would be ready for that. It can also affect sort of highland areas as well. So not just sort of latitudinal shifts, but also altitudinal shifts. And, you know, if we're starting to see, if it's too hot for vectors, then it's way too hot for humans. So we'll just see mortality due to a whole range of other factors.
Yeah, great point. Any other questions from the audience? Last chance, folks. If not, huge thanks again to you, Dr. Lowe. That was an amazing presentation. Blown away by your work and your team's work. Thank you all for your contributions. Sorry. Okay. More thank yous in the chat. No more questions. Thank you so much, and thanks everybody for attending. Please keep an eye out in the Cafe newsletter for our future State of the Science webinars. Thanks again, Dr. Lowe.
Thank you so much.